session. I wish you a happy, fruitful day. Please keep updated by downloading and following our interactive mobile app. Should you need any help, please don't hesitate to contact me or anyone of our organizing committee members. Thank you very much. Keep smiling. Have a wonderful day. Now, Engineer Rashid will join me on the stage. Can you come to the stage and introduce? Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the second day of the Innovation Arabia 10 today. I'm pleased to announce that we have with us today Professor Hilary Godwin as our keynote speaker for the environment and health. Professor Godwin has joined the UCLA faculty in 2006 and is currently a professor in the Environmental Health Sciences Department and in the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. She currently serves as Associate Dean for Academic Program in UCLA Fielding School of Public Health. She received a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry from the University of Chicago in 1989 and a PhD in Physical Chemistry from Stanford University in 1994. She conducted postdoctoral research from 1994 to 1996 at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine in the Department of Biophysics and Biophysical Chemistry, where she was the National Institutes of Health postdoctoral fellow. Please join me to welcome Professor Hilary for her keynote speech.
Thanks. I wanted to start by thanking the conference organizers for the honor of being here with you today and for hosting me at Hamdan bin Mohammed Smart University. And in particular, I wanted to thank the Chancellor, Professor Awar, and the Dean of the School of Health and Environmental Studies, Professor Arida, and the Chair, the Chair of the Department of Environmental Studies, Professor El Sigerni. And most of all, I wanted to thank all of you, the faculty, staff, and learners from HBMSU for your hospitality over the last 2 days. It's been really wonderful learning about your university and also learning about all the exciting work that's going on here. So I wanted to start with a parable that we often use to describe to people what public health is and how it differs from conventional medicine. So in this parable, we describe ourselves as a person who's sitting on the bank of a river and notices that someone comes floating down the river, and we jump in and rescue the person, bring them back to shore, and then see another person and jump in and rescue that person and bring them back to shore, and then see another person and jump in and rescue them and bring them back to shore. And the motto for public health is that whereas a doctor might sit there and be working with those individuals, pulling them into the shore and rescuing them, that the public health professional is the person who looks upstream and says, who's pushing all these people into the river, right? And so that we look at those upstream determinants of health and instead say, what can we do to stop, for instance, that person from pushing people into the river? So I think this is actually a telling parable in terms of our field. So not to say that I'm going to tell you about some examples of prevention today and a prevention-based approach, but I think even just this parable, the way we describe it as figure out who's pushing people into the river, is sort of at the core of some of the things that we haven't done as well. So this assumption that there's some evil presence out there that's causing problems for people, or some person or actor that's on the other side that's responsible for the ill health or poor conditions of the people that we're trying to serve. And I would argue instead that what we need to do is look upstream and see whether it's possible that, for instance, people are falling into the river because the conditions are too crowded upstream, right? Or that there's something going on that's so egregious upstream that people are actually intentionally jumping into the river, trying to avoid the circumstances that they're in. And so looking even farther upstream to say, what are those conditions and things that are happening upstream, as opposed to blaming other institutions or organizations for the conditions. But certainly I would say one thing that we definitely don't want to do as public health professionals is to build a wall along the river and prevent people from accessing it. And certainly we don't want to build a fence on downstream to keep people from coming ashore. So on that note, I'm going to talk a little bit about this approach that's called health in all policies, which is really trying to address this question of how do we look at those things that are upstream in a prospective way, so before people start falling or jumping into the river, to identify how we might construct policies and programs in ways that they benefit people's health. So it's really a call for the public health community to engage with a wide range of stakeholders to help be proactive in terms of health. Then I'm going to talk to you about a couple of examples where we've used this approach. The first is one from my home in Los Angeles in Southern California, where we've looked at the impacts, potential impacts on health of increasing use of recycled water. And then a second one that comes from a more global setting, looking at impacts of forest conservation on indigenous populations in Central Africa, and thinking about how we could inform the development of better policies and programs in that arena. And then I'll end with some lessons learned. So first, let me tell you a little bit about Health in All Policies. So this is a major initiative that's come out of the Public Health Institute, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and a number of leadership groups internationally to promote the idea that health practitioners should be involved in the creation of policies and programs. So it's not that the only consideration is health. It's not as though we're assuming that everyone's priorities are the same as our own, but rather saying that health should be at the table. It should be one of the considerations that we take into account when we're designing programs and policies. And then it's incumbent upon public health professionals to engage in those conversations early on so that we end up with the best possible policies and programs. So again, core to this idea of health in all policies is that the health of individuals is not just determined by their individual factors. So we often talk about our health being a factor of perhaps not just our genetics, but also the lifestyle choices that we make. But it's really also dramatically impacted by social and community factors and a wide range of socioeconomic, cultural, and environmental conditions that include not just things that we traditionally think of as being part of public health, like environmental health, sanitation conditions, working conditions, but also factors that include access to health services, and social and behavioral factors as well. So our goal in this engaging in the health in all policies is to really systematically look at those upstream factors that are associated with proposed policies and programs, to do that in a systematic way so that we can make recommendations about how to construct those policies and programs in ways that end up benefiting health as opposed to hurting people's health. So some of the core objectives of health in all policies are listed here. I wanted to emphasize that really central to this are ideas of equality and also stakeholder engagement. So core to our discipline within public health is discussing with other people, trying to understand their perspectives, trying to understand their priorities, recognizing that those may be different from those of health professionals, but in order to create programs and policies that are sustainable and that benefit communities and the people that we wish to serve, that we need to engage in that type of dialogue. And I would like to say that's very consistent with what we heard yesterday from the keynote speaker, Professor Javier from MBC, who really talked about this need that we all reach out to people who have different perspectives and to engage in those types of dialogues. And again, the idea being to create change as a result of those dialogues in a positive way. Okay, so I'm not going to go into a huge amount of depth about the methodology that we use to do this, or one of the methodologies that we use to do this, but I just wanted to give you an overarching introduction to it. So the methodology is called Health Impact Assessment. Many of you are probably familiar with environmental impact assessment, and this is something that I would say is a complementary approach to environmental impact assessment, and something that within the public health community we would like to see become a standard for new programs as an environmental impact assessment is today. So with health impact assessment, the overarching goal is to provide decision makers who are proposing a policy or program to provide them with systematic information about what all the possible impacts are on the health of the surrounding populations of that proposed policy or program. So we look both at the health benefits, potential health benefits, and also the potential health negatives associated with a program. So it's not to say that we focus on just one of those. We try to look at it holistically, understanding that with any policy or program, there's going to be pluses and minuses. But the idea of health impact assessment is to do this at the stage where planning is occurring so that it can inform decision makers at a point in which they can change the way the program or policy is formulated, ideally in a way that will help to maximize those health benefits and minimize any health risks. So as shown here, it's really the idea behind health impact assessment is to create changes in the implementation stage. So it's a very prospective process. And the idea of creating those changes is to actually change those upstream determinants of health as they are with respect to that program or policy, and hopefully in that way change health outcomes. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. The first one is one from, as I mentioned, my home in Southern California, where we've been looking at the potential health impacts of increasing recycled water use. So this project is part of a much larger program at the University of California, Los Angeles that's called Sustainable LA, or Living in a Hotter and Drier Los Angeles, which is what we're projected to have, certainly by the end of the century, but most likely by mid-century as well. And the goal of Sustainable LA is very ambitious. The goal is to conduct the research that's necessary to be able to allow Los Angeles to become water and energy independent by 2050. And I give you the link down here for the Grand Challenges website. Although this is based, the research components are based at the University of California, Los Angeles. I want to emphasize that this is a very intersectoral project. So the advisory board for this is jointly chaired by our chancellor and by the mayor of Los Angeles, and that board provides oversight not just for the Grand Challenge at UCLA, but also for the sustainability plan in the city of Los Angeles as well. And then we involve many other people across different sectors. Within the water sector, in the Sustainable LA Grand Challenge, we have three primary objectives. The first of these is to maximize local water supplies. The second is to reduce overall water consumption in the region. And the third is to improve local water resource management. And out of these considerations, recycled water is something that has come to the forefront as being a really good option from an environmental perspective. So our question then has been, what are the potential health implications of shifting to greater recycled water use? And how do those health considerations, how can they be integrated into the conventional considerations that are taken into account when people make decisions about water source choices. So the more conventional considerations that water management experts are looking at typically are cost, energy demand, and in our case, greenhouse gas emissions, because greenhouse gas emissions are regulated by the state of California, the sustainability of the source, so whether it's going to work for us long term, the technical feasibility, and public perception. And our argument is that that health impact need to be part of that decision matrix as well. So again, we were looking at this question of whether or not expanded use of recycled water, which makes sense from an environmental perspective, what the implications of that choice would be for human health. And so in order to understand that, you need to know a little bit about what we currently do in terms of water source choices in Los Angeles. So within the state of California, the majority of our population, over half of our population, is in the south, and yet the majority of our rainfall occurs and precipitation occurs in the northern part of the state. And about 100 years ago, urban planners decided to deal with this by constructing very large aqueducts to convey water from the northern part of the state down to Los Angeles. So the first of these was the Los Angeles Aqueduct that was built just over 100 years ago, and then also the Colorado River Aqueduct, which most people are familiar with, that brings in water from the entire southwestern basin of the United States, and the California Aqueduct, which is our primary source currently in Los Angeles, which brings water from the San Francisco and Sacramento Delta area down into Los Angeles. All of these systems are fed by snowmelt in the mountains. So they're acutely dependent upon precipitation that occurs during the winter months, and then as that melts, delivers water throughout the year. Currently, only 1% or less than 1% of the water that's used in Los Angeles comes from a recycled water source, so which is very, very low. So from a sustainability perspective, this is an obvious place to look in terms of trying to find avenues for Los Angeles to become water independent from other parts of the state and from other states. So in order to look at the potential health impacts of that choice, the methodology, this health impact methodology, relies upon creating maps that look at decisions and then intermediate effects and then health-related outcomes. So I show you this just to give you a sense of how we holistically try to examine all the different ways in which making a choice to switch to recycled water could impact health. So here are the different possible water sources. Currently, we mainly rely on imported water with a little bit of groundwater and very little recycled water. We've discussed building plants to do desalination, and there's also been discussions about increasing use of recycled water. Those then have intermediate impacts in terms of cost, water quality, and energy use that then translate into a variety of health-related outcomes. So an example of the energy use portion of it is not just that greenhouse gas emissions result in health effects linked to climate change, but that because of the sources of our energy tend to be rather dirty that we use for creating the energy to treat and move water, that there are air pollutants associated with that energy use, and that impacts air quality for the entire basin. And that, for us, is a major consideration, an immediate consideration, because Los Angeles has one of the worst air qualities of any city in the United States. So I wanted to show you this just so that you could get a sense of the methodology that's employed, and also to emphasize that in any of these scenarios, we don't just look at the one possible outcome, which in this case is recycled water, but use this type of diagramming in order to look at how it compares to the other possible options that are available, in this case, other water source options. One thing that's really critical in terms of water source choices in Southern California is how energy dependent they are. So about almost 20% of the energy that's used in our state is used for processing and moving and heating water. So for us, water and energy are intricately linked. So solving the water independence issue for Southern California is also critical to solving the energy independence issue as well. And I just wanted to point out that because a significant percentage of our water is imported over long distances, the process of moving water and pumping water is a significant contributor to that energy utilization in our current mix. So as part of this study, this is work done by a doctoral student, Sharona Sokolow, in collaboration with myself and Brian Cole, another professor at UCLA. We looked at the different, in this case, greenhouse gas emissions, so CO2 emissions, under 3 different estimates, a minimum, median, and maximum estimate, because there are error bars on a lot of these, for different water sources that are currently or potentially could be used in Southern California. This is currently where we get most of our water from the State Water Project, and you can see that the energy intensity and the CO2 emissions are quite high, comparable to what would be required if we switched to desalinated water. By contrast, groundwater is quite low, but unfortunately we don't have much room for expansion with groundwater because there's limited sources, and likewise recycled water is quite low. So from an energy use and greenhouse gas emissions perspective, recycled water is quite attractive compared to the current sources and other proposed sources like desalination. We then incorporated that into that flow diagram that I showed you before and used it to develop a qualitative estimate of the overall health impacts associated with those increased greenhouse gas emissions and energy production through these various different pathways of different water sources. So here, orange is our current imported water. Then we have recycled water, groundwater, and the proposed desalinated water. And you can see that in general, both the groundwater and recycled water tend to have smaller negative health impacts than either the current imported water or the proposed desalinated water. So from a health perspective, we would actually argue that there could be tremendous benefits associated with shifting our water supply from the current imported water to greater dependence upon recycled water. In addition, needless to say, we also looked at concerns about potential health risks associated with recycled water. Here we were able to depend on a number of risk assessments that had been done for the region. We're quite fortunate in that our neighbors to the south in Orange County have extensively used recycled water and have advanced treatment capabilities, and so we have a good understanding of what the potential health impacts are. If we were to adopt the same treatment programs that they use, so they tertiary treat for non-potable applications and for even indirect potable applications, not only tertiary treat, but then in addition do reverse osmosis, that the health risks associated with that recycled water use are extremely low and certainly comparable, if not better than the other water sources that we currently use. In addition, recycled water, as you saw, has lower energy and CO2 emissions than imported water, and the lower costs in the long run may make the investments in infrastructure that would be required for increasing use of recycled water within our area make this a really attractive approach. Okay, so next I wanted to turn to the example of using this integrative approach to look at the impacts of forest conservation policies on indigenous peoples in the Congo Basin. Very different group of people and different concerns. Here our question is it possible to construct, whether or not forest conservation policies actually benefit the local populations or whether they harm them. I'm choosing to focus on a very specific population because then we can actually address some of these detailed pathways. So I'll explain in a second why we selected this particular population. So you may be wondering, why would we even think that forest conservation could be bad for people? It turns out that worldwide there have been over 3 million people who have been forced out of their native homes that they're in forests in the name of conservation. And so those people are called conservation refugees, and typically are moved to areas where they don't, that have very different geographies, and where they don't have the resources that they need in order to continue their traditional lifestyle. The area that we're going to focus on today is in Central Africa, in the country of Cameroon. So here in the hinge of Africa. And specifically, we're focusing on an existing forest reserve that was established in the early part of the 20th century called the Biosphere Reserve that's in southern Cameroon, just south of the capital city of Yaoundé. The people that we're looking at here are predominantly an indigenous population known as the Baka, and they are traditionally known as the forest people, and have lived traditionally as hunter-gatherers, highly dependent upon the forest, but also extremely knowledgeable about the forest, and living basically in an integrative way with those ecosystems. In the 1950s, the Baka were moved out of the forest, first by the colonial administration and then by the independent administration within Cameroon, and for admirable reasons. So the people who moved them were concerned not only about preserving the forest, but also providing access to education and health services for these populations, and felt that by moving them to roadside villages that they would have better access to services and would end up being more developed, but also having better livelihood outcomes. Unfortunately, the impacts of that, moving them into these sedentary camps on the side of the roads, have had dramatic impacts, mostly negative, upon the livelihood and lifestyle of the Baka. So it has resulted in them being highly exploited by the local agrarian societies. In some cases, they have been subjugated by those groups that were already established on the roadside. They've rarely been included in decisions about managing the natural resources, and are actually explicitly excluded by Cameroonian law from owning land or having community forests because they haven't traditionally been in locations where they currently reside, which is a requirement for communities to own forest areas. So as a result, even though they're considered to be the forest people, their access to the forest is actually much more limited than it is for many of the surrounding populations that were traditionally farmers and continue to be farming communities. In addition, there have been impacts upon their social structure as well. So I showed you in an earlier slide the traditional hut or mandu of the Baka. Their communities traditionally would be mobile camps in the forest. They would build those huts and they'd be surrounding a focal point for the community. They're now living in communities that are predominantly more like the agrarian society that they're living in, where they have huts that are facing the road instead of facing each other. The impacts of that sedentarization have been dramatic on their health, and they have not been positive. So their infant mortality rate is quite high. Their studies are not very recent and not very comprehensive, but the studies that are existing suggest that their life expectancy and infant mortality are significantly higher than those of the surrounding populations that have traditionally been agrarian. But I don't want you to get the impression that forest conservation is the cause of all their problems. Really, a much greater contributor to their problems is actually deforestation. So this region, the Congo Basin, has been an area where there's been extreme amounts of logging conducted, and as a result, the degradation of the forest that these communities and their neighbors are dependent upon has been severely degraded. So certainly the idea of moving them out of the forest was not helpful, but for all the people in this region, I would say a bigger consideration is the logging and the degradation of the forest that they depend upon. And one solution that's been proposed at the international level has been a program called RED, which the idea of which is to invest from carbon-emitting countries, so high-income countries, to have them invest in forest preservation through these RED programs. And so it's basically a carbon sequestration mechanism to help preserve forests in low and middle income countries. Within this program, the UN has designated RED Plus as being not just that we want to conserve the forests, but also that we want to protect the social, provide social safeguards for the people who are living there. So our question has been, how can we inform these policies and programs in this particular region in ways that ensure that the local populations are safeguarded as opposed to further harmed? And the methodology that we've used to do that is not just a review of the scientific and gray literature, but also a collection of local health data together with stakeholder interviews to try and get a much better nuanced understanding of how local populations use the forest and how they're impacted by local forest policies. And then, as described previously, use that to inform the design of the policies and programs. This work was conducted again in collaboration with Brian Cole, another professor at UCLA who's an expert in health impact assessment, and our joint student Savannah Carson, who's shown here, who conducted interviews with residents in 4 different villages surrounding this reserve a couple of years ago. And the insights that we gained from that are very different from what we would have projected ahead of time. So ahead of time, I thought the top priority of the BACA would be that they wanted guaranteed access to the forests. But in fact, what we heard back from them was that their top priority was access to education for their children. We also heard from them that in order for them to be able to limit the amount of hunting that they do in the forest and contribute to the preservation of biodiversity in those forests, that they need access to sustainable protein sources. So that was an important consideration and should be taken into account in any conservation policy that's developed for the area. And finally, we heard very loud and clear that sustainable jobs development programs are critical and that those programs should be not just for men, but also for women as well. So finally, I want to talk a little bit about lessons learned, and then I'll turn it over to you for questions. So the first one of these lessons learned from both of these projects, but I think that applies to health and all policies more broadly, is that it's really important to look at these health impacts holistically. So not just to fixate on one particular pathway or outcome because that happens to be the one that we think a priori might be the most important, but instead to really delve into looking at this whole map of different pathways and the potential ways that programs and policies can impact health. And the second is that local engagement, and I would say of both men and women, is really critical to the design of successful programs. So we heard very different things from the men and the women in the villages. For instance, it was predominantly from the women that we heard that the communities, the BACA communities, valued education so strongly. So it's not to say that the men didn't value that, but it was not the top thing that they mentioned. So hearing from these different voices was really critical. Also, we learned that the mechanisms of engagement really matter. So in the case of the work that we did on the recycled water and with the majority populations in Cameroon, the approach of using stakeholder interviews or key informant interviews actually was quite helpful and very appropriate. What we found with the Baka was that that's not a comfortable setting for them. So they tend to engage in consensus building and group decision making. And so isolating one member of the community and taking them into a closed environment as strangers and asking them a bunch of questions was not something that promoted happiness in the community. So it's something where, in retrospect, going back into these communities and doing a larger scale study, I think we would probably do a different type of consultative process as opposed to key informant interviews with that particular community. And this is just to show you that an example of the previous one was talking to a chief in the majority population. This is a conversation with the entire community in a Baka community. And then in addition, that long-term engagement with these communities is absolutely critical. So it's very easy to do that when the community that you're studying is your home. But when it's someplace that's far away, really continuing to go back and follow through on the outcomes to see whether or not the changes that you've implemented have been communicated to stakeholders and that they're being implemented is really critical. And here we're very fortunate to be able to leverage contacts with my colleague, Tom Smith, who had been working with people in these particular villages for over a decade. And here's shown with the chief from one of the Baka villages who he's worked with likewise for over a decade, who served as a field researcher for him back when they were both a little bit younger. So that's absolutely critical. And likewise, partnering with local NGOs and community-based organizations that work with the target populations is critical. We leverage this both at home in Los Angeles when we look at impacts on local communities, but it's at least as important, if not more so, when we go into international settings as well. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge the people who contributed to this work. So all of the work that I described was collaborative work with Professor Brian Cole at UCLA, who's one of the leaders in the field of health impact assessment, and it really has been a joy to work with, and two doctoral students that we co-supervise, Sharona Sokolo, who worked on the Recycled Water Project, and Savannah Carson, who worked on the project in Central Africa. And then Fabrice Penchine, who was a master's student in Cameroon, who also worked on this project and was critical for the interview. And then the extended team, both at UCLA and in Cameroon, that have created this partnership called the Congo Basin Institute that brings together partners locally and from different countries to address capacity building within the region. And then finally, some of the pictures that I showed you were from two professional photographers who joined us one year. So I wanted to make sure I acknowledge their beautiful photographs. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to you. And of course, thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Godwin. We will open the floor for the questions right now, and we'll just hold on for the mic to come by.
Good morning. I'd like to thank you for such a wonderful presentation. My name is Kifah Hasni. I am a PhD candidate at Hamdan bin Mohammed Smart University. Actually, I felt that human nature always goes toward fixing the mistakes after doing the wrong thing. After Industrial Revolution, we started thinking about occupational safety. After occupational safety strategies, we started to talk about health in all policies. Now I think it's the time not only for health in all policies, looking at your presentation, it's a lot of environmental impact is there. So I feel it is health in all policies and environment in all policies. It should be there. Otherwise, I feel the plan cannot work properly. And really today with this presentation, I understood that really the college from where I am, health and environmental studies, it should be that way. You cannot just leave one beside, separated from the other, because it is not only human factor that's affecting us, but we are also affecting the environment, and in fact, negatively. If we will look at the changes in the climate, the endangering a lot of animal species, and even if we will compare the taste of the food 10 years back from our today's taste, it is really different. So this is what my observation. Now I'd like to ask you what you think can be done from your experience as a strategy in UAE with the current available resources, scarcity of water, sometime green areas, beside the current embedded comorbidities in the society. How we can make things, from your experience, that it will work better without reinventing the wheel. Thank you.
Yeah. So thanks, and obviously I completely agree. Completely agree with you that people and the environment are intricately linked. In terms of recommendations for the UAE, and I don't mean to avoid your question, but I genuinely believe that the answer to that question lies in this room. So the answer to that question cannot come from somebody from the outside visiting your beautiful country for 2 days and then saying, oh, I have the solution, right? Because that's going to lead to an uninformed solution. The solution is that the people who are in this room work together with other stakeholders here in the UAE. And sure, you want to look at the literature to see what has worked in other countries, but you also need to do that while examining the local context to come up with solutions. So whereas I would be thrilled to partner with people here to help with that process or to provide input into that process, I would never presume to just walk in and say, I know the answer to your problems. But I do genuinely think that within public health and environmental health, we have a lot of methods at our disposal that can help to provide really good, sustainable solutions. Yeah.
Hi, good morning, everybody. First, I would like to thank you for your presentation. And I have two questions. My first question related to using of recycled water. We all know that the demand on desalinated water is very high compared to the recycled water. And you presented about engagement of social engagement of people, and was sharing the results of impact analysis part of the engagement, like transparently share the results of those studies. That is my first question. My second question is about the safety of using the recycled water as a strategic water tank storage.
Okay, so let me just check and make sure that I understood the question. So the first one was about whether or not we were going back and providing the results of the health impact assessment to key stakeholders. And the second one was a question about
using of recycled water as a strategic water tank.
Okay,
how safe it is.
How safe it is, okay. Okay, so with respect to the first question, actually let me start with the second one, so the safety part. So here's a good example of where, at least from my initial conversations with the students here, which have been really great, that there are significant differences in terms of the technologies that are used. and so as a result, the local conditions. So for us within Southern California, and well, California in general, in order to use recycled water, even for landscape irrigation, it has to be subjected to tertiary treatment. And any even indirect potable use is currently within California, the jurisdictions that do that not only do tertiary treatment, but after the tertiary treatment, do a reverse osmosis treatment that would remove, for instance, virus particles and things like that. So as a result of that high level of treatment, in our particular circumstances, the health risks associated with the recycled water use are low. But that's not to say that that could be very different under circumstances where the treatment was different. In terms of your first question, again, understanding the local constraints is very important. So for us in Southern California, desalination has not taken off the way it has in the Middle East. And one of the reasons for that is that, so here's where you guys have a huge advantage in terms of being a young country, is that in terms of your energy, and my understanding is energy infrastructure and the water infrastructure being built, some of those things being built at the same time, having power plants co-located with desalination plants dramatically reduces the cost associated with desalination. We don't have that, and we don't really have that as a possibility in Southern California. So as a result, the total energy utilization for desalination is much higher for us. And that makes it much less tractable. There's also been huge environmental pushback in terms of desalination, and to accommodate the demands from the environmentalists has created additional costs associated with desalination. So our desalination is not the same as desalination here. We have much greater constraints. In terms of communicating back to the stakeholders, yes, absolutely. So that is the whole point of the project, is not just to do an academic exercise, but to actually then identify who are key decision makers and go and talk to those individuals. So in terms of the water utilization in California, that includes water decision makers. And in terms of the forest conservation program in Central Africa and Cameroon, there we're actually working collaboratively with the government of Cameroon that's designing their RED Plus program and helping to feed that information back into the RED Plus design.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Yeah. About
Sorry.
Okay. About the point you mentioned that in your presentation, with all thanks, that you mentioned that less than or almost 1% of water used in Los Angeles or California is from recycled water. As I am a health policy maker, I know that Los Angeles is not like UAE or other countries which have water considered as a scarce resource, because in California they have a lot of water resources from groundwater, surface water, rivers, whatever. So why I use very costly solution for water resources like recycled or even desalinated water when I have already available groundwater or surface water? Moreover, even for recycled water, talking about safety, as I know in UAE, we don't use recycled water for human-related activities like for drinking or agriculture. It's almost used for industrial or even for agriculture and roads or whatever. It's not really a way of human because of safety consideration. Thank you.
Yeah. So the first question that you had was why would we look at costly sources of water when we could just use groundwater? So although we do have groundwater, there a couple of different problems with it. One is that there's not sufficient groundwater to be able to provide water for the entire population because we have such a large population in the LA basin. Another is that, unfortunately, much of our groundwater is contaminated from industry. So there's some areas where the groundwater is not even usable. And then the third is as we deplete groundwater, particularly in these coastal cities, what we see is that seawater intrudes into the aquifers and contaminates the aquifers. So even where there is groundwater, we are very limited in terms of how much we can pull out of it. So as a result, we're forced to go to other sources. This other source that we've predominantly used has been this imported water from other parts of the state because we invested 50 to 100 years ago in the infrastructure to bring that water over long distances. So part of what we're looking at now is the question of whether continuing to invest in that infrastructure versus investing in a new infrastructure for treatment of water to be able to use recycled water, which of those is the more tractable, sustainable solution. In terms of the question of use of recycled water, the same thing that you described is true in the regions in California that currently use significant amounts of recycled water, which is that they predominantly use that recycled water for landscape irrigation and industrial applications. The challenge that we have there is in order to do that, the municipalities have to build a second set of pipes, which we call purple pipes, because we have very strict regulations to prevent mixing of the two water sources. And because the area is so large geographically, it's very expensive to build that purple pipe. So, so those are some of the costs. That's one of the considerations, is it worth investing not just in the technology to do the purification, but also the technology to be able, infrastructure that's required in order to disseminate that recycled water. So those are some of the sort of things that the community is weighing in terms of future investments.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask a question if time allows. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Question, please.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Professor Godwin. I really appreciate your talk. I'm an environmental chemist, and I recently moved from Australia to Dubai. Quite fascinating. Obviously, every country deals with different issues. I wanted to sort of, you can share your thoughts on your opinions on the livestock agriculture, the progression of that industry, deforestation needs to support that industry, and the environmental impact of that industry generally on the planet Earth.
So which region are you referring to in terms of livestock agriculture? Are you talking about in like California and regions? Like, what are you talking about in the Congo Basin?
Generally in America, I guess, a lot of rainforests have been deforested purely to support the agriculture, to grow, obviously, the corn and soybeans to support the livestock production. Obviously, there is overconsumption, increasing overconsumption of such products in human use. And obviously, there is an enormous impact, environmental impact, in relation to the livestock agriculture, purely growing an animal will take much longer and obviously use a lot more water resources, energy resources than we generally do for the growth of a plant. Yeah.
So yeah, that's a great point. And I should also say that, since you're Australian, that Australia is sort of the country that we really look to within in Southern California, sort of the global leaders in terms of dealing with some of these issues proactively. Sydney in particular has done an amazing job in terms of revamping their infrastructure to be more water and energy efficient. In terms of impacts of agriculture, so within the state of California, so certainly a huge percentage of our water is used for agricultural purposes, but agriculture also drives our economy. And we're also one of the main producers of fruits and vegetables for the entire United States. So although we could actually successfully deal with a lot of our water issues by limiting agriculture to non-water intensive crops, that probably from an economic standpoint is not going to be possible. I do agree with you, however, that judiciously choosing to promote agricultural practices that do not require tons and tons of water makes sense. So one example of something that doesn't make, as you pointed out, that is very water intensive is, for instance, raising cattle, which is done extensively in California. Another is that we grow cotton, and we're importing water, and we grow rice, both of which are very water intensive. So those are examples of things that are not very sustainable and perhaps not the wisest choices of how to use our limited resources.
Professor Hilary Godwin, thank you so much for the presentation and addressing the questions. I mean, I call in Professor Mustafa Hassan, the Vice Chancellor for the Academic Affairs at Hamdan bin Mohammed Smart University, to present the Trophy of Appreciation to Professor Godwin. Thank you.